Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming-events.htm.
Thank you all for coming out to the library tonight. I'm Lee Birchfield. I'm the director of the Louisville Free Public Library, and it's my pleasure and honor to be able to welcome you all and to introduce the two folks who are going to be talking to us tonight. I want to start with a reminder to silence your cell phones. I already remembered to do that for mine earlier. After the author talk is finished, we will open the floor to questions, and during the question period, we do ask that you come up and use this microphone here if possible. If you're not able to come up to the microphone, if you raise your hand, I'll grab the microphone and bring it to you. We're recording this so that we can put it on our podcast page on our website, and the microphone helps us get the questions as well as the answers. Also, after the talk, Carmichael's bookstore is here and will be selling books after the event because Ms. Hodges will be signing. So thank you, Carmichael's, for being here. I can't make eye contact with them because there's a column in the way, but I'm looking at you and thanking you for being here to sell books tonight. They are a partner for us on a number of events, and we really appreciate it. They're also like just a really awesome independent bookseller. So if you haven't been to see the folks at Carmichael's, please stop by there when you can. Tonight's author talk is part of the Craig Buteau author series. This series is named for LFPL's former longtime library director, and whenever I say that, I always think it makes it sound like Craig's no longer with us, so I assure you he's still also very much alive and living in Louisville. This endowed series is made possible through the generosity of donors to the Louisville Free Public Library Foundation. I would also like to thank Louisville Public Media and WUOL for being our media sponsor for tonight's event. So I've mentioned Carmichael's Bookstore, I've mentioned the Library Foundation, and I've mentioned Louisville Public Media and WUOL. Let's thank them for their support. Thank you. Thank you. You all are good clappers. So speaking of WUOL, tonight's author will be in conversation with Daniel Gilliam. Daniel is a Louisville native and currently serves as the program director for WUOL. And Daniel was also kind and gracious enough to agree at the last minute to substitute and come and do this interview, and I'm really grateful for that. In addition, he's also a composer and a host for Louisville Orchestra concert talks, and just a really nice guy. So I don't know if you've ever had a chance to meet Daniel. This is my first time to get to spend some time talking to him, but thank you, Daniel, for being here. Now, for tonight's author. Natalie Hodges was born and raised in a Korean-American family in Denver, Colorado. She's performed as a classical violinist throughout Colorado and in New York, Boston, and Paris, as well as at the Aspen Music Festival and the Stowe Tango Music Festival. She graduated from Harvard University and writes about music, science, racial politics, and cultural assimilation, apparently sometimes all in the same book. And also writes about Korean and Korean-American history. Her first book, Uncommon Measure, A Journey Through Music, Performance, and the Science of Time, was longlisted for the 2022 National Book Award and named a New York Times Editor's Choice. I'm going to ad lib now. I'm going off score. One of the things I learned from reading her book is that classical music is also sometimes improvised, right? This is a fantastic book. If you're here, so some of you probably have read it, some of you may not have, and were dragged here by someone. It's really a great book. Tell your friends about it. People, especially who are former or recovering musicians, will particularly enjoy it. But I just thought it was one of the most beautifully written books I've read in quite some time. So I'm really excited to have Natalie here to talk to us about her life, her insights into human existence, and about the writing craft. Please join me in welcoming Natalie Hodges and Daniel Gilliam.
Let's do it.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. I just want to say a huge, huge thank you to Lee and Paul and Megan and the staff of the library for making this happen. I'm so happy to be here, and to you too, Daniel.
Well, wonderful to be here.
Yeah, and to everybody for coming out. Thank you so much.
Well, before we start talking and have what's going to be an amazing conversation in only a very short period of time, will you read a little bit from the book for us?
Yes, absolutely. So the passage that I'll read comes from a very early portion of the book, and it talks about, it was sort of a pivotal moment in my life when my relationship with music started to change after having been very intense and very constant for my entire life up till that point. Okay. The performance was going well, almost unbelievably well, in fact. I'd practiced counting down each time the theme returned as a way of getting through the piece, of keeping track and also keeping up morale. Only 3 more repetitions of the theme to the end, now 2, now 1. Yet something strange started to happen as I counted those returns down. I felt, and this is the only way I know how to describe it, that I was inside the music's time, in the heart of a tolling grandfather clock whose gears turned at an allegretto grazioso rate of 6/8 notes to a bar. The bell tolled on the hour of the theme, but the time in between was itself whirring and unfolding, development by development, variation by variation. Ticking off the theme's returns, I felt at the same time how each section engendered the next, how they progressed into and referred back to and complicated one another, and how, in always circling back to the theme, they shaped a globe of time, a sphere of sound. Each variation's passage changed the feeling of the theme that followed it, inflecting it with a memory of all that came before, so that even as each theme relocated itself in the present, it echoed with the ghostly chimes of the past. Then I remembered that I was supposed to mess up. Time, which had been bubbling steadily along, froze. My hand seized up. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion, yet too fast for me to catch up. My left hand wouldn't shift smoothly up the fingerboard, which was unfortunate, because the chromatic and arpeggiated runs accelerate from the original tempo and require, by the final measure, about 3 shifts per bar. My right hand, meanwhile, decided it was no longer capable of holding the bow, causing my bow hold to collapse and my fingers to lock white-knuckled just to keep from dropping the bow entirely. Then it happened. Just before the last chord, I dropped the bow. I was forced to play the chord by plucking the strings in what was perhaps the world's unluckiest and most spontaneous demonstration of pizzicato. It's almost comical now, but whenever I think back and try to analyze what happened, I am still stricken by the memory, sick and visceral, of how it felt when time stopped. Why is it that one sense of time, so supple inside the music itself, seizes up and cracks beneath an audience's expectant gaze, or as soon as one becomes aware of that gaze, that expectation? Why does getting into the flow of the music require yielding yourself to its time, feeling its flow through and around you, when all the while time is also the enemy, the thing you're running out of as you play along, trying to make it to the end, and yet trying to make something of the moment while the music lasts? If you can't get into that flow, if your nerves get the best of you and you're dragged onto the shore of self-consciousness, well, chances are you'll mess up that tricky run, or play the last chord as an anticlimactic pizzicato and hurry off the stage with your head bowed. In performances like my botched Paganini, even when you've been dreading all the while that something will go awry, you're never prepared for it. The flow is staunched, the fabric rent. You feel punched in the gut, knocked out of the music's time and back into your own. And then afterward, you can feel the seconds and minutes passing. You trudge through, it's all linear. You just want it to be over. You just want to make it to the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You just want to make it to the end.
Yes. Not now, though.
Not tonight, hopefully. Thank you for reading a part of your book. Your book and your narrative flows between these musical moments, whether you're describing something in great detail down to the tempo marking, the Italian words for the tempo, to bigger things like emotions and
Yeah.
broader, and then you move into science, and we talk about quantum mechanics and particle physics, and you admit that you're not a scientist, and eh, I'm not either, but I also have an affinity for those sorts of topics. Has that been something that you've always found about yourself? This maybe a duality?
Yeah, well, it was actually music that sparked my interest in science and in physics in particular. I so this performance where I really had my nerves get the best of me and had to question whether violin was going to be an option for me. That happened toward me at the end of high school, and pretty much from then, my relationship with the violin was really fraught, and it was over and over this experience of feeling like time had stopped, and I wasn't sure what was producing that, like, and if I was the only person who ever felt that. But in college, I was taking actually a general education, like evolutionary biology course, and
Hmm.
we could do whatever we wanted for the final project. And I thought, well, I'll look at the evolution of human musical ability, and maybe what some of the biology and neuroscience behind that. Um, and I came across a theory that in some ways became the inspiration for the entire book, which is um, it's it's two things. It's the idea that our ability to create music and participate in music as humans comes from how advantageous it was for us to be able to synchronize our movements to a beat, right? Even when we're not making music, like you know, when we were hunter gatherers, groups that could synchronize their movements with each other just had a better chance at survival, and uh, that in turn is the result of this really streamlined loop that we have in the brain um, that connects our auditory cortex and our motor cortex. And so it's interesting, when we perceive a beat, right, our auditory cortex will fire off like action potentials that the motor cortex responds to. And that's why we can clap to a beat that we hear pretty much instantly. But the motor cortex on its own will start firing back signals in return, and actually our ability to move to that beat or coordinate our bodily response actually shapes our perception and our ear's perception of the beat as well. So I felt like my experience of time and in time as a musician, in some ways that was very hopeful for me, that I could see that it was grounded in neuroscience. And because time is such a preoccupation for physicists as well, that kind of just became natural when I was grappling with what it meant to feel like I was out of time, and what does it mean to feel like you're in it, and why does that sense change so much. It felt natural to then look at the realm of particle physics as well, even though I'm not an expert, which is where time itself kind of starts to break down.
Right. Yeah. Towards the end of your book, you talk about the particles that sort of move together,
Yes.
even though they're not in the same physical space. And in music, it's not that at all. We're always together when we're making music.
Yes.
And whether it's in front of a conductor or playing a solo piece, there is this larger force, right, that's guiding your playing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Under a classical physical framework, particles have to like actually act on one another to produce some kind of effect or to change one another. But in quantum physics, what's amazing is that you can have two particles that are, light years apart, and if they're entangled, and that's a very murky word in terms of what actually means, but if they are, if they share something, and they can actually, like, changing the polarity of one particle will instantaneously change the polarity of the other if they're in that entangled pair. And so for me, like, even though I use that construct as a metaphor in the book for what kind of became a saving grace for me as I was navigating my relationship with music, which was that really to play with other people and or even when I was performing, play to other people. Even though, of course, you're right. When we're performing with other people, we're in the same space, but it's not like we're touching. And sometimes, I'm sure you know, as a conductor as well, and as a singer, like there are really miraculous moments where you almost can anticipate what another person is going to do before they do it. And you kind of ask like, yeah, how do I know? But there is this really beautiful synchronicity that can happen, and it kind of enables you to improvise together or perform the music in an improvisatory way together, because you're anticipating what someone else is going to do and almost responding to that ahead of time. And yeah, for me, that the entangled particles provided a metaphor for that and a way of encapsulating that feeling.
Yeah. Well, going back to this loop you talked about, which I thought was really amazing. I had not heard it before reading about it in your book. I had to sit with it for a little bit to think, well, now why is that? Why, if you're doing an action in sort of a repetitive way or at a tempo, why does your body need to create this feedback loop?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, and I'm not a physicist. I'm also not a neuroscientist.
Yeah, right. Sure.
But I think, I wonder if it's that the increase in the amount of information that you are able to, maybe there may be some connection to our reward pathway or something. Like if you start clapping to a beat and maybe you're a little bit off, but then the more you kind of are able to synchronize yourself with it, I don't know. It is this fascinating element of our biology that movement engenders our sense of rhythm or changes it. Yeah.
Well, if you're a musician, or even I would say even an athlete, I think we often talk about musicians and athletes having very similar pathways and metaphors, and I can think of a team working together in a similar way, perhaps. But when things are in sync, and you're on stage and everyone's moving together, the melodies, the harmonies, everything's lining up, the rhythms are lining up, it feels good. There's just a sensation of achievement. But then as soon as something is off, even if it's just yourself, right? Like you miss a note or you're behind the beat a little, all of a sudden you feel that dread, like things could go off the rails here very, very easily. So maybe that's part of it too, I guess.
I think that's a great explanation for it. And I think if you go back to what is posited as a statistical universal of human music is that in every human culture has music, and in every culture it's something that people can do collaboratively, that people do together. I think that would really make sense then, that if it comes from this benefit that we get from being able to synchronize with other people and entrain not just to an external beat but to other people, the more you coordinate your movements with that, the better you're doing, and the brain rewards that. I think that's a great point or hypothesis.
You talk about I think this book is the way I read the book, or what I took away from it was your reckoning with improvisation.
Yes.
And through all of it, the thread is this dichotomy between doing, quote, exactly, and I put it in quotes because there's no way to exactly do what's on the page, because if you perform a piece of music today and tomorrow, those two are going to be completely different.
Yes.
No matter how exact you are in that performance, right?
Yeah.
You even talk about it in your book, and once I was interviewing a conductor who looked at the audience and he said, this is a really special moment because this will never happen again. This room right now, this will never happen again. No matter how hard we try to replicate it, we could invite all of you back. We could do it on the same day next year with hopefully the same weather, but it wouldn't be the same, right? It happens once.
Yeah.
And so even there's that part of you that wants to play exactly what's on the page, even though you know you can't replicate it, why be so exact about it if you know it's
Yeah.
the second time it's not going to be the same? But then improvisation, from what I took away from your experience, is that improvisation is that permission to be different next time, right?
Yes. Um, I thank you for reading it that way because I didn't go into writing it thinking that it would be grappling with that for I didn't think that that was really what it was about, but afterward, in a way, that's kind of what enabled me to move on from the part of my life that had been so um, rigorously defined by violin and by it's exactly what you said, trying to recreate something the same way every time. And I really did have this hope that I could because I had a very narrow conception of what I thought was perfect in an interpretation or perfect in execution. And so much of it I thought that I can mitigate the fact that nothing is going to be the same, and you have to be okay with things coming up or the way you perform something being different on any given day. I thought I could, just with enough hard work and repetition and routine in my practice, I thought I could get around that because I didn't want to let go of that. Yeah.
It's a giving up of control. It's you talk about improvisation being sort of order out of disorder, and there's so much disorder in music. And why are we so hung up on perfection? And, quite frankly, I think recordings have done a great disservice in that regard.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, that's a really great question. It does come down to the culture around classical music and specifically the history of Western classical music, which is really defined. Or a lot of musicologists and music historians say that really the defining feature of Western music is its literacy. So we write scores down and we recreate from that. It's not just improvising something. It's not melodies that are passed down by a teacher singing to their students. And it's interesting because before the advent of, and I'm sure as a composer you can fill us in on this much more, but prior to the advent of written scores, music was improvised and it was passed down like through Gregorian chants were memorized by monks. And the advent of scores was, I think, on one hand, really a democratizing force for Western classical music because you can disseminate a score, and people who wouldn't have a chance to learn how certain melodies go or to learn within certain traditions now could, because those scores could be distributed. At the same time, composers started adding a lot more direction and many more markings for how they wanted something to go because most people didn't have access to teachers, or they weren't inside traditions where they could learn this is exactly how you play this type of phrase. So the more detailed scores became, the more musicians, I think the less free they felt to rely on instinct or to try to improvise. And it became about recreating this thing off of a page. And then I think you're absolutely right. Once we have recordings and some of them become really iconic, and you have in the 19th century this explosion of classical soloists like Paganini and others who were the divas and rock stars of the day.
Franz Liszt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then it becomes about recreating the way they play because there is seen as a right way to do it, or a pinnacle of this tradition.
Well, and you kind of poke a hole at that because you say something about Paganini having a physical condition that allowed him to sort of do these superhuman things. We talk about Rachmaninoff's finger span being ridiculously long, and so it's like, well, how do you expect a human to play this if a person with sort of this extraordinary ability created that music?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Paganini had, they're pretty sure he had Marfan syndrome, which really elongates one's arms and does, your hand span is just bigger than most people's. Um, yeah, it is funny how that kind of perfection became the standard. And honestly, aside from the role that recordings really took on, I'm not sure. My best guess is that classical music is something that really, really responds to hard work and just, I mean, and because it's such a physical, inescapably physical thing, the more labor that you put in to practicing, the better you're going to get. And you're not going to reach Paganini's level, but in some ways it's easy, and this is how I felt in some ways. It's easy to feel like, well, if I had done 8 hours of practice today instead of 5, would I get there? And that's that same kind of democratized and rarefied aspect of classical music. Like anyone can put in the work, but that does only take you so far. It's just really hard to figure out where that line is.
Yeah. Well, and I think as a society, we certainly value proficiency in our entertainment, right? Whether it's
Yes.
sports or music. We value proficiency, and if you want to if you want to be able to make a career out of something, then you have to be a certain proficient at
Yes.
something to do that.
Yes, you absolutely do.
Um, as I was thinking about improvisation, as you were writing about it in your book, um, it's really been, I think, more of a recent thing for so-called classical musicians to not be able to improvise. Really, the 20th century is the anomaly out
Yes.
of the many centuries that this music has existed. As you talked about Gregorian chant and the in Baroque music, the
Yes.
so-called basso continuo was literally improvised
Yes.
over a bass line. And there's the famous story of Beethoven, one of his piano concertos, I forget which one, maybe it's 4, where the guy who's turning the pages for him sits down as one of his students and looks at the page and this is a firsthand account. It's not a rumor; it actually happened. He looks at the page and he said, "I don't know what he was reading because there was literally no music on the paper, but apparently he just improvised
Yeah,
one of his piano concertos." So it seems like
absolutely.
a really recent thing for classical musicians not to be able to improvise.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, I grew up playing violin, and I didn't know how much of a part improvisation had played in the history of Western music. And I think it's an important point that even as scores were being written down and people were reading music, like it did. You're absolutely right. It didn't mean that improvisation went away. Like I think Bach is probably considered to be one of the most the one of the greatest improvisers of all time.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think it does come from. It goes back to what you said about proficiency and then the role that performers sort of took on in the culture, and that was really, I think, concentrated or intensified in the 20th century when the performances could be not just scores, but actual performances, great performances could
Yeah.
be by Heifetz or Perlman or whoever, could be then disseminated via recording. But I think once music kind of became something like, or Western classical music became less like something that you would play with your family or play with your friends for fun, and became this thing that soloists did, right? It is kind of like, why would I listen to somebody who's not as good when I can, you know,
Well,
to
and
something at that
if
level.
in all transparency, if someone were to send me a recording that was had mistakes and a flub that was prominent,
Yeah,
I would think twice before playing it.
yeah. I
Uh,
wouldn't listen to myself. I don't listen to Zach Perlman.
right. I mean, yeah. So it's I feel like I don't think we're being hypocritical here. It's just we're all that way. We all feel
Yeah,
certainly that to achieve something of that greatness, it does
yeah,
require a lot of work, and sometimes we just decide that's just not what we want to do with
yeah.
our lives. And you found that in that
Yeah.
moment. Now, years later, did you ever, and I know, certainly you can read it in your book, but do you ever go back there mentally?
To that place of being
Yeah.
really fixated on perfection. Not in music, actually. These years later, it's kind of been the first time that I've been able to play
Mm.
for fun. I never played for fun
Hmm.
before. It was music and fun were just not things that I associated with one another, unless I was performing, and that came with its own burdens
Hmm.
and baggage.
Hmm.
I think in other realms of life, absolutely, and
Yeah.
I think writing about it and realizing how much I had put music in those terms of needing everything to be perfect and to be absolute and to be, I think for me the biggest thing was recreatable, like just not
Mhm.
feeling like I could let something go, or if I had played something well in practice, not being willing to let that go,
Mhm.
or not feeling like a performance was good enough if I hadn't been able to play it exactly the same way. I mean that's something that everybody has to grapple with,
Mhm.
and uh, realizing that was a comfort for me, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the book, you talk about your upbringing and how being Asian American and the stereotype that Asians are really good at math and music
Yes.
played a big role in not being able to sort of leave the mold that you were given.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, that kind of expectation that we've been talking about, that of like technical perfection, which, being able to execute something technically is always going to enhance what you're able to say with your music emotionally. And
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think that's an important connection.
Mhm.
That is especially heightened for Asian American musicians. Um, it's a stereotype, but it's also true that many Asian families who immigrate to the United States have their children play um, classical music, and it's
Mhm.
usually violin, cello, piano,
Mhm.
um, and for me, there was always the sense that for myself and for other Asian American students that um, it's kind of this, you want to get really good at it because it's this sense that, oh, if I am able to perform well in this thing that is so important to the culture I'm living in now, I mean,
Mhm.
even as classical music has become, I think, less important culturally, like it's still um, it represents this great part of Western art, and or
Right.
at least with um, European roots,
It can be a
and
status symbol, I feel
it
like.
it is very much. And I mean, if you think about concerts,
Mhm.
the presentation, I guess, of orchestras for many years has been,
Right.
we're very exclusive and we're very elite. And I think for um, Asian Americans who immigrated to America, it was the sense like, if I can get really good at this, I'll be accepted, and our
Mhm.
family will have made it. Um, and there is also a really tremendous value that's placed on just hard work day in, day out in a lot of Asian cultures, and that's something that classical music responds to very well. So I think that is why so many Asian American musicians like achieve this level of technical proficiency. It's because of there's the cultural factor, but then there's also this compounding expectation. Well, if you're an Asian American, you'll be very good. Like, it would be an anomaly if you weren't
Right. Right.
able to play a really difficult concerto. So
Mhm.
that all builds on itself, and it's this desire to make it and show that you can participate in the culture. And I'm also sure that this is true for other minority groups as well in classical music. Like,
Right.
you just feel the standard is doubly high.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was always difficult to navigate. The other thing that is hard for uh, at least hard for me as an Asian American musician too, was people expected that it was my mother who was forcing me to practice, because my mother's
Mhm.
Korean, and that she was this tiger mother who
Tiger
controlled.
mother, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I wrote about in the book how that's not true, but still, the number of people who come up to me,
Yeah.
they're like, your mom must have really been a taskmaster and made you practice.
Yeah.
Um, but I think for her, it's really the ultimate luxury as somebody who came to this country was to be able to give her children something where we had an outlet for creative expression, and our lives didn't just have to be about trying to get the highest paying job or just trying to make it and survive. So yeah.
Yeah, you talk about immigrant parents wanting to give their children the thing that they didn't have.
Yeah.
And your mom seems to love music and
She
the
does.
violin.
Yeah.
And do you think that all of your siblings had that same experience, or have you talked to them about this?
Yeah, I think so. I think for my sister and I, we were the two who really, for a while, thought that we were going to be professional violinists, and that was our dream. And so I think we took it more. We took things more to heart and took it. There was more anxiety associated with that for us. I
Yeah.
think I've got two younger brothers, and they're very, very good, but they play more for fun, or they've been able to balance that desire to excel without feeling like your life and its meaning hinges on how well you can play this instrument.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad for that.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's wonderful seeing you. We were talking earlier about how your youngest brother takes from one of your teachers, and it must be
Yes.
really wonderful to see him, sort of progress through that stage as well, but maybe in a
Yeah.
different way.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone to his lessons on occasion and sat there and taken notes, and it's weird because it's the same setup. He's standing exactly where I was. It does feel like time has kind of folded in on itself. But what I really hope for him is that he, without feeling like it's something that he has to prove about himself or who he is or anything, that he's just able to, appreciate the beauty that he gets to be around every day when he's practicing, and that he's capable of creating, and that's my hope for him.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
I think he does.
Yeah, good. Through all of your reflection, I know he has a lot of good guidance. I'm sure as he gets
So-
older.
It's a fun thing to share with your. I mean, that's something that I'm grateful to my mom for
Yeah.
giving us. Yeah.
Time. What a weird thing.
Yes.
When we started this conversation, it's now in the past, right?
Yeah.
What happens in 5 minutes, nobody knows.
Yeah.
I often think there really is no future or past. It's just the present, right? We live in the present.
Yeah.
You talk about all of these variables. There are an infinite number of ways that this evening could go.
Yeah. And to me, that was why improvisation was so fascinating. Like it's not how my brain works. I've never been able to do it. But watching musicians who can, and in particular, there's a pianist who I wrote about in the
Yes,
book. Her name is
Gabriela Montero.
Yeah, she improvises actually within a traditional classical idiom. So, I mean, you can look up her recordings on YouTube, which I highly recommend. And if you listen to it, you wouldn't know that the whole thing is improvised. You would think you're listening to a pre-composed fugue or a concerto or something. And that was what was really fascinating to me. It's like how, right, if in every moment you're, consciously or not, making a choice about what you're going to do next, or or even if it's more that you're just kind of letting it happen, and it's spontaneous, but it's not random. That was what was amazing to me, is that you're, in some ways, like the end of that performance, like the final chord that she's going to play is right connected by this thread to the very beginning, the first chord, and somehow, right, it doesn't exist yet in the middle. So understanding how that connection is created in this way that makes it feel as though it was always there from the beginning was really fascinating to me, because I mean that is just how we end up living our lives anyway. And there's actually a quantum physical parallel to that, which is there's something called the path integral, and it's this idea that if a particle wants to move from point A to point B, space and time, there's really an infinite number of paths it could take. It could go from here to here. It could go around the universe and end up here. It could go at different speeds, change up its speed within that path. So there's really an infinite number of paths it can take. but actually, if you add up, and I don't know the math on this, but if you were to add up all of those vectors, essentially for all of its potential paths, um, what you will get, like some will add and then subtract from each other if you're sort of combining them together and integrating over them, but you'll end up with the path of least action is what it's called, which is I don't know. It's kind of amazing how that works, because if the particle can choose any path to take, and at the same time it's always going to take one that is informed mathematically or physically by every other path. To me, that seemed so much like improvisation too, because every choice you make in any given moment, there's also infinite others that you aren't taking, and they all kind of converge in this way.
Yeah. And at the same time, while there are an infinite number of ways that the rest of this evening could go, most of us would say that there's probably a predictable set of them, right?
Yeah.
Based on where we are and who we are and sort of the information that we have around us.
Yeah.
So when people think about improvisation, yes, it's all made up, but there's still, as the particles, there's still a path of least resistance, maybe, or at
Yeah.
least there's some predictability to that.
Yeah,
right?
very much so. It's still there's still some structure and constraint, and
Mhm.
there was a musicologist who I was reading when researching the book, and she made this really good point that improvisation, right? We can think of it as representing freedom, but it's not really free, because
Mhm.
it's only intelligible within, right, a certain set of musical constraints. It has to be, something that, if somebody is improvising for all of us in this room, it has to be something that we would recognize as music because we grew up listening to a certain tuning system or
Right.
whatever it is. So there's like control and not control, or
Mhm.
freedom and constraint are so close in
Mhm.
that. And that was actually a question I had for you too as a
Oh.
composer. Wayne Shorter said, let's see, composition is just improvisation slowed
Mhm.
down. And so I wondered what your relationship is to improvisation as somebody who, right, at some point you're sitting there choosing the
Yeah.
notes to come. You're also making something to be performed later another
Right.
time.
That's an interesting question, and they are very linked. I think it's uh, I think there are composers who take a very mathematical approach to composing and writing. It's sort of going back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier, where the score has information for you to interpret. And it's one of the few art forms, by the way, that happens. If I were to hand all of you a Shakespeare play, you could read that play by yourself. You wouldn't need necessarily a production, But if I were to hand you a Mozart, maybe some of you could, but if you don't know anything about music, it doesn't do anything for you. And
Yeah.
so that information on the page is so important for musicians, right? And you allude to this in the book, how as music progresses, composers get more and more specific with the things that they want. And there are
Yeah.
composers today who put so many constraints on one note, you know. But in the end, your forte, your loud, might be different than my forte. Um, and so I think as a composer, for me personally, and I can only speak for myself, is that I very much love to think of the act of improvisation as something that can happen in the process of writing. Um, Again, there is some predictable direction where this could go, perhaps, but then on that score and that music that the performer you will receive, um, there's a certain improvisatory element where you will decide how forte is that forte, how
Yeah.
slow is that slow down, unless I put a specific tempo marking. But even then,
Yeah.
you're not
can't
gonna
control it.
perform it with a metronome, and so you can perform it, and you might get close on stage with that, right? But
Yeah.
at some point, you have to release control,
Yeah.
and we could get into the politics of that, of a composer or a style of music that provides complete control to the musician versus the one that says that constrains you to
Yeah.
every single finite piece of information on
Yeah.
the paper.
Yeah.
Um, and certainly within the writing process, it's and I want to talk about this a little bit about the perception of time.
Yeah.
Um, we perceive time in different situations differently.
Mhm.
Sometimes the day is slow. Well, today went by really fast. But what does that
Yeah.
mean? What
Yeah.
happened in that day that gave you that perception?
Yeah. Oh no.
Or when you're performing, do you
Yeah.
lose a sense of time? Do you lose a sense of time if you're playing?
I mean, yes, and I've felt it happen very different ways. I mean, I think when I drop my bow and I can't play, I mean, it does feel like the time doesn't exist, and all I
Mhm.
wanted was to be able to get back into the flow of the music because, right, all music is we're demarcating time in a lot of different ways, but with sound. Um, and then there are other times when I have been lucky enough to feel I kind of just click into that flow, and you can let go because you feel confident in what's going to come. It's almost like you're remembering ahead, and I feel like that's, I mean, just based off other people's descriptions of what it feels like to improvise, I feel like that's the closest I've ever been able to get, is that I just am okay, even though I'm performing a piece that I've memorized, I'm okay to relinquish, worrying about what's going to happen in
Mhm.
2 bars down.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, that was a lot of the motivation to include science in the book. Not just that I had was trying to explain the anxiety or anything, but it was hoping that drawing on all these different fields of science where time and time perception are studied, physics and neuroscience, um, and evolutionary biology, even in some ways, would be that I was hoping to find a way of grounding what it means to be in time in something
Mm.
objective and
Mhm.
concrete. Because the scary thing is that all of us experienced the time of today differently. Like for some of us, it went quickly. For another person, it kind of dragged on, and that feels so isolating to me, just existentially, to
Mhm.
think about.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I was looking in the science for what I feel music can do, which is, we could all sit here and we could be listening to the same piece of music, and that for however long that piece of music lasts, time is being demarcated in the same way for all of us. Like we're all kind of our that loop in our brains is locked in to a specific time signature and to a
Yeah.
specific tempo, and I mean, and that's why people performing the same piece of chamber music can have that moment of seeming entanglement
Mhm.
and anticipation that they share. Or even like if you go to, I don't know, you go to a concert and everybody is kind of bumping along to the beat in the same way, it does represent this unified way of being in time, and it never lasts because the music has to end. But
Right. Yeah.
I don't know that science has been able to keep up with music in that way, because how do you quantify that? No, you
Yeah.
just tap along or clap along with somebody else,
And slow music slows down time, right? We feel
Yeah.
that time slows down, or if you're listening to a fast passage or a fast movement in a symphony, that time will feel like it is moving forward a lot quicker.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so fascinating. Um, and when you bring up you talk about this one piece in particular, you spend a lot of time with it, is the Bach chaconne
Yes.
in D minor, which is this monumental solo violin work that you can read about in the book that is for sale, which you should. So we don't have to go into the details of it in the book, but
Wikipedia also has a great article. Just saying.
and there are so many great performances of it out there. In fact, there were composers over the years who would take this one instrument piece, this solo violin piece, and arrange it for other instruments so that other people could
Yeah.
play it, because they thought, well, it's so great. Why not? Pianists can play it, and
Mhm.
but as you look at something like the chaconne, that is so complex. temporally. Is that the right way to say it? It's so time moves in so many different ways in that piece, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a really I'm sure some of you are familiar with this piece. It's one of Bach's most famous. Uh, what's interesting about its form is that a chaconne is basically this repeating bass line. So it's the same chord structure over and over again, with some variation it can repeat, but it's this thing that's held constant throughout the entire piece, and then those chords, right, can kind of give form or give shape to a lot of sort of melodic and contrapuntal material over it. But basically, that bass line becomes the theme out of which the whole piece flowers. And so you have this thing that's repeating circularly over and over again, but you get moved, linearly through time through this 15-minute piece, and that's what is so miraculous about it. Um, yeah, and so I spending time with that piece for me, like the other thing about it is that it is this holy grail for violinists because it's really, really technically difficult. You're up there, you're alone. It's 15 minutes, and it's the last movement of his second partita. So you've played a bunch of other movements before, and then you have to kind of rise to meet the occasion of this chaconne. And because it's so canonical, violinists kind of develop a chip on their shoulder about it because you feel pressured to have your own interpretation of it. You're trying to play in a new way something that has been done over and over again, but also to make it make sense, and you don't want to just do things just for the sake of being original.
Yeah.
So it's really a lot to grapple with. And for me, it was, as I was kind of leaving my violin career behind and my studies behind, it was the piece that I had tried to learn it in high school to kind of no avail, and I thought, well, I don't want to go out without being able to play this. And so grappling with that piece, trying to learn it in order to say goodbye, and also just being really to take that piece on, you have to be conscious of the way that form moves through time and the way that you have something that gets from point A to point B, but also is just this great repetition over and over again. And in fact, the opening phrase is identical to the final phrase, so it almost is it's as though the whole thing unfolded inside of one moment. And coming to the end of my life with violin, as I had known it, I was very conscious of that. Yeah.
Were you able to say goodbye?
No, I still like to play, but I did say goodbye to my aspirations of being, somebody who travels around and gives solo recitals and concerts or plays in a really esteemed chamber group. The way I play now is I play a lot of weddings, and I like to play with my siblings sometimes when they're in town, and that we're playing. It's all music that is much easier. A lot of it is based on pop music, actually, when I play weddings, because people want a string quartet version of their favorite Coldplay song. And so actually, when I'm playing, that music does not always translate that well to a score for string quartet, so a lot of times you're just relying on knowing the song. And that's a fun challenge that really forces you to not just be stuck trying to get through the piece linearly, but you rely on knowing what comes next and feeling it. So and that's really fun because then you get to be part of somebody's wedding day.
Yeah. I want to read one passage from your book and one more sort of thought or question, and then we'll open it up to your questions. It's from the chapter on improvisation, and you say improvisation. You're reflecting on something I believe Gabriela Montero said, perhaps, or someone else. It doesn't matter. This is what you say. These are your words. Improvisation, then, can be seen as an uncanny manifestation of deep memory itself, the creation of order out of disorder, a deep uppouring from some dormant part of the soul, a confirmation that the mind knows things it does not know it knows.
Yes. Well, almost all of those were my words. The very last part is from St. Augustine.
St. Augustine, yes, that's right. You were quoting St. Augustine
Yeah.
prior to that.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to sort of wrap our time up, unfortunately. That's gone by quickly, my perception of time anyways. Yours is different. I wonder if all music, whether it's Bach Chaconne or the most complex modern score or a Beethoven symphony, all music strives to feel improvised and spontaneous. Like therein lies the power of music in that sense that this has never happened before and will never happen again. Even if it is supposed to be played exactly how the composer intended, we want it to feel singular and important, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a lovely way to put it. That feeling of singularness or singularity and importance would come from the fact that it won't happen again. And I think that's the best perspective that you can have on music and maybe on just what it means to be alive too, is that you want it to, I don't know, in some ways it almost puts more of an emphasis on the fact that like we're here together, like all of the variables that have made us cross paths at this moment, like that we can, I don't know, it's almost a way of doing some honor to that, to know that it won't be the same again, and it puts more of an emphasis on the fact that it's these people here and now. So yeah, I think to know that music can do that for us is, I wish I had that perspective on it earlier, and I'm grateful to feel that more now.
Well, it certainly comes across in your book, that journey. Natalie Hodges, thank you so much for your thoughts and your words today.
Thank you.
And now your turn to ask a question. Don't be shy. Come up to the microphone. There's no way to make this not awkward, so you just have to walk in the center and walk to the microphone.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Enjoying the talk. If changing from aiming towards more of a professional career in music to something else impacted your sense of identity or something like that, I'm wondering if it did, if you could talk about that, like how that sort of unfolded.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. It did. The way I had identified so long was as a violinist first, and it was so connected to the role that I felt I had in my family. I was the oldest sibling of 4 kids who all played classical music. It was really difficult to let go of that because it was also just so much of how I had structured my time too. And when I stopped practicing, I had 8 hours in the day that I'd never had before. And to be honest, when I stopped kind of aiming for that, I struggled for a long time because I felt that all of the desire for control that I had and that I kind of forced into my music, or music was a way that I could exercise that desire for control and feel like I was coming close even if I really wasn't. That spilled out into just the rest of my brain, into the other areas of my life. So it was actually a very dark time for me after I stopped aiming for that. And I had to, I think the hardest part was actually not even thinking about, oh, what am I going to do with my life now and who am I going to be? But my entire past had been shaped and dictated by this endeavor to be a musician in the way that I thought it, was the best way to be a musician, or what it really meant. And for a while, I kind of felt like, well, this whole past has gone to waste. And writing I don't necessarily want to say that writing the book, I didn't do it to process that or to be able to change. But it was just something I was very conscious of when I was writing, is that I had kind of moved from a point where music was my entire, like the reason behind everything that I did in my life. And now was this thing in the past that would obviously shape what I was able to do going forward and what I wanted to do, but the entire way that I narrated my life to myself was different. And I thought that was really scary because I almost felt like, oh, I'm going back and I'm like coming up with justifications for why it didn't work, and maybe there's something I could have done differently, and I would still be on this path. And so, yeah, I was really conscious of re-narrating my own story to myself, and to feel like it was something in the past was really different. So
it's always very brave to take that leap outside of the narrative that we tell ourselves sometimes.
yeah,
Whether it's I'm supposed to do this, or I was trained to do this, or this is what my parents wanted me to do.
yeah.
It's always very brave to take that leap.
Yeah, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does make you wonder how much our sense of time and of our own lives, it just does hinge on the words we use to describe it, and that felt very flimsy to me. It was the first time I had to come to terms with how flimsy that was. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you. Hello.
About music and time,
Yes.
and how each performance really is never going to happen again. But what about those times when it's important that it's pretty close to what happened before? I'm thinking of two instances. The way Galileo demonstrated that gravity is a constant
Yes.
was by putting different weights on an inclined plane, and he timed them with music, which meant that the music had to be pretty much the same, with a 1 pound weight and a 3 ounce weight. And the other is Carl Brown, who was the photographer, D.W. Griffith's photographer. Somebody asked him, because everything was hand cranked, how do you get it so steady? And he said, well, I love opera. And so he would sing the anvil chorus to himself as he was turning the crank. And if he didn't get it right, of course, the film wouldn't play right.
Right.
What do you think? I mean,
That's I did not know that Galileo had timed his experiment with music. I think I guess this is a great question. For me, I just from my own experience as a musician, it was like, yes, I guess if the person who's singing opera like botches completely, like, I don't know, like his voice cracks or something, or he slows down too much, that would affect the timing. For me, when I was talking about getting it right and getting it the same, it wasn't necessarily that I would do something that was completely destructive in the middle. I mean, sometimes I'd drop my bow and completely throw it off, but the anxiety that came around it for me was like, even if there was a moment that I had worked really hard to craft into something that I felt was beautiful, or the way that I wanted to express the phrase, if I didn't do it like that, I felt that that performance had fallen short, because I just wanted to be able to play it as best I could every time, and that includes kind of from an emotional and musical perspective, more than just the I'm going to play in tempo and I'm going to play in rhythm. But it's really funny that you mentioned Galileo, because his that experiment is a great example. Well, I guess really any experiment that has shown something very fundamental and true about our universe is that it's an example of what is called time translation symmetry. So we could recreate that experiment now, and we'd get the same result. We'd prove gravity all over again. And so symmetry is this concept in physics that if we move a system in some way, so we could either move it in space. So I could have a little experimental setup right here. I could do it over here, and then I could do it over there. Or I could do it in Colorado, where I live. if the system has symmetry, it means that no matter where I move it, space translation symmetry, no matter where I move it in space, the physical properties and the way it works will stay the same. That system will be intact. And that Galileo's experiment is an example of time translation symmetry. So he could do it when he was alive, we could do it now, and that it would still be true, it would still hold. And that was that idea of time translation, of wanting something to happen the same way in time. I didn't know that that's what it was when I was, studying music in high school, but that is what I wanted. I felt like if something is true and good, I'll be able to recreate it. And yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. It's a rare. It doesn't. Our lives are not time translated from day to day, but some really true fundamental things are. So yeah, thank you for that question.
One more? Yeah, come to the mic.
I try to ask questions, and sometimes to get started takes a little bit, but first, I wanted to ask you a question about the beginning of this presentation this evening from a perspective of music and time.
Yes.
Do you think it would help to have had a tuning up of this room first to where we all are on that concert master's note?
Couldn't hurt. You do. I had a teacher who would always say he would get mad if people didn't tune their instrument well, because he'd say, it's 4 free notes. It's 4 free notes. Why wouldn't you just make sure that you're in tune?
Surely, because for me, to sort of share the story without going on too long, but I was born in Little Rock and would play the trumpet growing up. And this lovely lady decided to bring the Philadelphia Orchestra to Little Rock for its sesquicentennial, and my uncle was the auditorium manager. So for Eugene Normandy, the request was to chill the room down to the optimum, the lowest temperature, because the heat that the orchestra generates, all the people in there back in the 1970s, it was an incredible challenge to get the players in space, and of course I got to hear them, and they would perform Respighi's Pines of Rome.
Wow.
So by the end of the month, I hope to go back and hear this. But the part of it that's curious, to me is at least, when I heard or saw you were going to have this presentation here, over at the train station, there is this clock that they have in the floor, and I was wondering if this was all coordinated as a narrative in this community to try to synchronize or become tuned up, because I'd be schooled in city planning with an interest in entropy and light and sound. And how do we get to be where we are more conscious of the asymmetrical and symmetrical to enjoy the heck out of this performance this evening?
That's a big question.
That's not a problem, but see, I get into sort of circling around, but it's somewhat complexity and quantity, but it's also about the qualities of the music that we have played by being here to witness this space this evening. Nowhere else will this have occurred, but to put the questions out where we can all begin working on it this evening, and tomorrow will be a new day, hopefully a better day.
I think, I don't know if this is going to answer your question. I think it's lovely what you said. There's that concept that I talked about, the path integral, right? Which is this idea that there can exist some order within time, even when we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But there is a way to, that's somehow like the way something ends and the way something begins, they do, I don't want to say influence each other, but there is some kind of form that can hold up in time, like within all that entropy. And then there's this other idea that you may all be familiar with, which is the arrow of time. And it was Stephen Hawking's, he said that he thought, he conceived of time as having 3 arrows. And And one is just entropy, like which is just the direction of time as it flows. And it's this idea that the later we are in the universe, right, the more disorder there is. So I don't know, like an egg breaks or a family splits apart, and every future moment has more disorder than any other past moment. And even in the creation of memories, like even if you think of creating a memory as creating some kind of order and giving some kind of order to your past, right? The energy that your neurons had to expend in creating that outweighs the creation of the memory itself, just in terms of the order that it represents. And so there's the arrow of entropy, just disorder increasing, and then that's the other arrow is the psychological one, is that as we move forward in time, like we have no idea. We don't know what's going to happen to us in the future, even though we know what happened to us in the past. So there is an asymmetry of how we even perceive ourselves. And so it's funny that that entropy can coexist. To me, it's funny that entropy can coexist with a path integral, something that, in setting something in motion, right? Everything that could have happened influences what does, or the future can kind of change the past in that way, even as we kind of reconsider how we narrate our lives to ourselves. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you brought up entropy and also what it means to be in a community, and I think to me that seemed similar.
But there's a part of what you're saying. I was with you, and I would do this artwork for School of Art in Chicago where I bowed the arrows. It's not a straight arrow of time. It's like your bow, but it's curved. But when you get into space and performance, in the shtick knows more of where it's smarter than any of us, because it's such a special moment to be in an auditorium or a community struggling to tune itself up after tragedies, and to go on, but to show the world we can peacefully assemble. It's just incredible to have you here and y'all have this conversation.
Thank you.
I'd even get a now clock where there's no numbers.
A now clock.
But thanks for holding time stable.
Thank you so much.
You
Thank
bet.
you. Yeah.
Oh, and thank you all. I think that's probably it for us. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Let's hear it. Yeah. Fabulous.